The first shadow appeared on the coldest night of the year. It was not cast by anything I could see. No candle, no car headlights, no passing figure, just a shape, long, bent, and breathing, stretching across my bedroom wall as the heater clicked off and the house settled into its winter groan. I lay still, listening. The wind scraped its nails against the window. Somewhere deep in the walls, pipes knocked like hesitant footsteps. My breath fogged the air, slow and shallow, as I stared at the shadow's edges ripple, as if it were adjusting itself. I told myself it was nothing. That's what you do at first. The shadow moved. Not sliding like light does, but leaning, inch by inch, closer to the ceiling. The shape narrowed at the head, too narrow to be human, and the arms, if they were arms, hung wrong. Too long. Too patient. Then I heard it. A sound so quiet I thought it came from inside my skull. Don't turn around. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. It was familiar. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. The shadow twitched, as if pleased by the sound. I clenched my eyes shut, counting breaths, waiting for the panic to pass. When I opened them again, the shadow was gone, but the room felt occupied. And from downstairs, something creaked, slow, deliberate, like a footstep that knew exactly where I was. Winter had already claimed the town by the time I arrived. Snow didn't fall here, it settled, like it had decided to stay forever. The roads were narrow tunnels carved through white walls, and the sky stayed the color of old metal even at noon. The kind of winter where sound feels swallowed, where your own footsteps seem too loud, too exposed. I hadn't planned on staying long, just until things felt normal again, just until the silence stopped ringing in my ears. The house was my grandmother's. Everyone in Raventown still called it that house, the way people avoid saying a name out loud when they're afraid it might answer back. It stood alone at the town's edge, its back facing the black pine woods, dark, frozen, endless. The moment I unlocked the door, cold air breathed out at me. Not rushed. Not angry. Waiting. Inside, the house smelled like dust and old winters. Furniture sat exactly where she'd left it, as if she'd only stepped out for a moment. The clock above the fireplace was still ticking, each second sharp and deliberate, too loud in the quiet. I told myself it was grief making everything feel wrong. That's what grief does. It turns memories into traps. I dropped my bags and turned on the lights. Shadows snapped into place along the walls, stretching longer than they should have. The hallway looked deeper than I remembered, the far end sinking into darkness even with the bulb glowing overhead. I stood there longer than necessary, listening. The house wasn't silent. It hummed. Soft, low, like a breath held too long. That night, the wind howled through blackpine, dragging branches across the siding in slow, uneven rhythms. I lay awake in my old bedroom, staring at the ceiling as shadows swayed gently with the passing headlights outside. Except one didn't move. A shape clung to the corner above the door. Too dense, too still. I blinked hard. When I looked again, it blended back into the dark. I laughed quietly at myself. "Get a grip," I whispered. The word whispered felt wrong the moment it left my mouth. The house felt closer after that, like it was leaning in. Sleep came in fragments. Every time I drifted off, something pulled me back, an imagined sound, a sudden pressure in the room, the sense that I wasn't alone. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. A step. Not the sharp crack of wood cooling. Not the groan of old beams. A step. Slow. Careful. Upstairs. My heart hammered as I sat up. The house had always made noise at night, but this was different. This had intention. Whoever, or whatever, was walking knew exactly where it was going. I listened as the steps crossed the hall, then stopped, right outside my door. I held my breath, counting seconds that felt stretched and warped. The knob didn't turn. The door didn't open. Instead, a voice slid through the crack beneath it. Not loud, not threatening, just close. "You came back." My stomach twisted. The voice sounded pleased. I didn't answer. Silence returned, thick and watchful. After a long moment, the steps retreated, fading down the hall and into nothing. Morning brought no comfort. Daylight revealed small things I was sure hadn't been there before. A chair angled slightly toward the hallway, a door left ajar that I knew I'd closed. Shadows lingered longer than they should, clinging to corners even when the sun pressed against the windows. When I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. The neighbors didn't wave, didn't smile. Some turned away too quickly. Others watched openly, their expressions tight and unreadable. At the general store, the cashier avoided my gaze. "You're staying in the old house," she said. Not a question. Yes. Her hand paused mid-motion. She leaned closer, voice barely audible. "Winter isn't kind to that place." "Why?" I asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Because it remembers." That afternoon, I found my grandmother's scarf folded neatly on my bed. I hadn't unpacked it. The fabric was cold, colder than the room. That night, the shadows grew bolder. They stretched across the walls like long fingers, bending where they shouldn't. When I moved, they lagged, just enough for me to notice. And then, from somewhere deep in the house, something whispered my name. Not calling, recognizing. I stood frozen in the hallway, heart racing as the lights flickered once, twice, and went out. In the darkness, a shape shifted, and something inside me understood with sinking certainty. Whatever had been waiting through all those winters was no longer alone. I stopped trusting silence after that. Silence wasn't empty in the house. It was observant. It listened. It learned. When the heater shut off, the quiet pressed in so tightly my ears rang. Even my own breathing felt like a mistake, like something I shouldn't be doing where it could hear me. I began leaving lights on. All of them. It didn't help. Shadows still gathered where they wanted, thickening in corners, stretching beneath furniture, clinging to ceilings like stains that refused to fade. At times they seemed to pulse, swelling slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. I told myself not to stare. That was the first rule I made. The second was worse. Never answer back. The voice returned the following night. I was washing dishes when it spoke from the living room, calm and intimate, like someone leaning close over my shoulder. "You always hated the cold." My hands slipped in the sink. A plate shattered, porcelain exploding against the tile. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. "That's not funny," I said, my voice trembling despite myself. The shadows behind me shifted. "You cried every winter," the voice continued. "You begged her to stop telling the stories." My chest tightened. I remembered that. My grandmother by the fire. Her voice low. The room dark except for flickering light. Stories about shadows that followed people home in winter. Stories I'd tried to forget. "Stop," I whispered. Silence answered. That night, I dreamed of blackpine. The trees stood unnaturally close together, their shadows tangled and overlapping. As I walked, the ground crunched beneath my feet. Not snow, but something brittle and hollow. Bones. I reached a clearing where shadows hung from branches like coats left behind. One peeled itself free and stepped forward. It didn't have a face, but it knew mine. I woke screaming. Something had left fingerprints on my arms. Dark, cold impressions that faded slowly as if sinking into my skin. I didn't go back to sleep. The next morning, I went to the library. It was the only place in town that felt warm without trying too hard. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, dust motes floating peacefully in the air. For a moment I felt almost normal, until I noticed the librarian watching me. She was an older woman with tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she sorted returned books. When I approached the desk, she didn't smile. "You're in the house by Blackpine," she said. Everyone knew. "I need information," I replied. "About the winters here." Her jaw tightened. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Follow me." She led me past the public shelves, past the children's section, to a door marked Archives. Inside, the air was colder, older. The smell of paper and something faintly metallic filled the room. She pulled out a box. "People used to leave these," she said. before we stopped collecting them. Inside were journals, dozens of them, handwritten, different ages, different styles, all worn thin by time and handling. What are they? I asked. Confessions, she replied. Warnings. Last attempts. I opened one. The first entry described a man seeing shadows that didn't belong to him. Another told of a woman whose reflection began moving before she did. A child wrote in shaky letters about someone standing in the corner of his room, whispering stories he already knew. They all mentioned winter. They all mentioned waiting. One line appeared again and again, written by different hands. They don't arrive. They wake up. I felt cold creep up my spine. Why didn't anyone leave? I asked. The librarian met my eyes. Some tried, she said softly. The stories followed. As I turned the pages, my chest grew heavier. One journal, dated decades earlier, stopped me cold. The handwriting was my grandmother's. Her entries were careful, measured, terrified. They're stronger when remembered. They weaken when ignored. But they never forgive being forgotten. The last entry was short. If he comes back in winter, I won't be able to stop them again. I slammed the journal shut. Stop them how? I asked. The librarian didn't answer. She was watching the shadows near the shelves, her lips pressed into a thin line. You should go home, she said quietly. Before night. The house felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. Too quiet. Too still. The clock above the fireplace had stopped. I checked my phone. No signal. That's when I noticed the furniture. It had shifted. Not much. Just enough to change the shape of the room. Chairs angled toward the hallway. The couch turned slightly inward, like it was watching something. I backed away. From upstairs, a soft dragging sound echoed. Slow. Deliberate. I locked myself in my bedroom. The shadows gathered almost immediately, thickening beneath the door, stretching upward along the walls. I sat on the bed, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the doorknob as it rattled once, twice, then stopped. A whisper slid through the wood. You never finished the stories. I don't remember them, I said. The shadows swelled. Yes, you do. Memories surfaced uninvited. Me as a child, hiding under blankets while my grandmother spoke. Me covering my ears. Me begging her to stop. Her voice, steady and sad. If we don't tell them, she'd said, they'll tell themselves. The door creaked open. I screamed. The hallway was empty, but the shadows lined the walls, layered and deep, overlapping like a crowd pressed too close together. I ran. Outside, snow swallowed my shoes as I sprinted across the road to my neighbor's house. Mrs. Calder answered after the third knock, her eyes wide with recognition. They've started, haven't they? She said. I nodded, shaking. She let me in. Her house was warm but dim, lamps casting soft light that barely touched the corners. Shadows stayed close here too, but they were quieter, more respectful. They don't like company, she said. Too many witnesses. What are they? I asked. Ghosts. She shook her head. No, they're what happens when stories are left unfinished. She told me then. Long ago, before Raventown had a name, people disappeared every winter. Not violently, not suddenly. They simply faded, forgotten by everyone except the cold. An old woman discovered the truth. The shadows weren't killers. They were replacements. They filled the spaces left behind by loss, grief, and silence. They wore familiar shapes, spoke familiar words. And when spring came, people couldn't remember who had been real and who had not. So she told stories, Mrs. Calder said. She named them, described them, gave them limits. And my grandmother? She continued it, she replied, until she got tired, until I stopped listening. That night, the shadows came from Mrs. Calder. I heard her scream from across the road. By the time I reached her house, the lights were out. The door stood open. Snow drifted inside, undisturbed by footprints. She was gone. The next morning, No one remembered her. Not her name. Not her house. Except me. And the shadows. They followed me home, stretching long and satisfied across the snow. "Your turn," they whispered. That was when the paranoia truly began. I questioned every sound, every reflection. My own shadow felt wrong. Too heavy, too close. At night, the house replayed memories I didn't want. Doors opened onto childhood rooms that shouldn't exist anymore. Voices mimicked people I loved. My grandmother appeared at the foot of my bed, her eyes dark and hollow. "I tried to hold them," she said. "But you have to finish it." "What?" I cried. "Finish what?" "The story," she replied. Then she stepped backward into the wall and became a shadow. By the time I realized the truth, it was already too late. The shadows weren't trying to scare me. They were trying to remember themselves. And they needed me to tell their story before they told it for me. The night the house turned against me, winter reached its deepest point. No wind. No snowfall. Just a frozen stillness that felt intentional, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I knew it before midnight. The shadows were no longer content to watch. It started with the locks. I checked them one by one. Front door, back door, windows. All secure. I told myself that control mattered, that preparation meant something. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then every bulb in the house went dark at the same time. The silence that followed was wrong. Not the absence of sound, but a pressure. Thick, crowded, full of waiting. My phone buzzed in my hand. No signal. No notifications. Just a single vibration like a pulse. Then the clock screamed. Not chimed. Screamed. The ticking above the fireplace sped up violently, the sound rising into a sharp metallic shriek until the hand spun backward, snapping free and clattering onto the floor. I stumbled back, heart pounding. That's when the shadows detached. They peeled themselves off the walls like wet paint, sliding downward, pooling across the floor. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. They already owned the space. I backed toward the hallway, every instinct screaming to run, but the house stretched around me. Rooms longer than before, doorways too far away. A whisper passed through the dark. "Don't rush the ending." I spun. They stood at the edges of the room now. Figures shaped like people but unfinished. Some lacked faces. Others wore faces I recognized. Neighbors. Strangers. Mrs. Calder. Her mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. "You promised," it said. "I didn't," I cried. The shadows leaned closer. "You listened." The house groaned, beams bending as if under immense weight. Doors opened and closed on their own, slamming in slow, deliberate rhythm, like punctuation. I ran upstairs. The hallway was longer than it had ever been. Shadows crowded the ceiling, dripping downward like tar. My bedroom door stood open at the far end, darkness spilling out. I reached it, and fell. The floor dropped away beneath my feet. I landed hard, breath knocked from my lungs, in a place that wasn't the house. Snow crunched beneath me. Black pine. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, the trees packed too tightly together, their shadows layered and tangled like living things. The sky was starless. Winter without mercy. Shadows moved between the trees, separating themselves from trunks, stepping forward as shapes. Tall, thin, familiar. They surrounded me. And then one stepped closer than the rest. My grandmother. She looked almost right. Her face was hers, but her eyes were empty, filled with shifting darkness. "You came back in winter," she said softly. "I was afraid of that." "You're dead," I whispered. She nodded. "And not." She gestured around us. "This is where unfinished things go." The shadows leaned in, listening. "You taught me," I said desperately. "You told the stories. You said they'd keep us safe." "They did," she replied. "For a while." She knelt in front of me, her hands cold but solid. "But stories are promises," she continued. "And promises break when they're abandoned." The trees creaked as if in agreement. "They're not monsters," she said. "They're echoes. Reflections of loss. Of people who vanished when no one remembered them anymore." "Then why do they hurt people?" I shouted. Her expression darkened. "They don't," she said quietly. "They replace them." The realization hit me like ice water. Mrs. Calder. The journals. The people no one remembered. They weren't killed. They were overwritten. The shadows shifted, growing clearer, more defined. I saw pieces of myself in them. Gestures, posture, expressions. "They want you," my grandmother said. "Because you remember. And because you don't." A low sound rose from the woods. Not a growl. Not a roar. A chorus. Voices layered over each other, whispering fragments of stories, memories, names. "Tell us. Finish it. Make us real." I covered my ears. "No," I said. "I won't." The ground cracked beneath me. The woods folded inward, trees bending, shadows surging forward like a tide. Hands, too many, grabbed at my arms, my legs, my throat. I screamed. The house slammed back into existence. I was on the floor of the living room, gasping, shadows crawling over me like living weight. Walls warped, windows stretched, glass rippling as if underwater. The front door swung open. Beyond it, nothing. No porch. No snow. Just darkness. The shadows pulled me toward it. "Step through," they whispered. "Let us finish." I clawed at the floor, nails scraping wood. "No." A voice cut through the chaos. "Stop." The shadows froze. My grandmother stood in the doorway, solid now, real in a way she hadn't been before. "I held them back for decades," she said. "But I can't anymore." She looked at me, tears cutting clean lines down her face. "It has to be told," she said. "All of it." The shadows began to writhe, furious. Now they hissed. I understood then. They weren't satisfied with fear. They needed acknowledgement. They needed someone to speak them into limits again. My grandmother stepped aside. I stood shaking. My voice felt small in the vast, crushing dark. But I began. I told the story. Not just mine. Theirs. I spoke of winters that swallowed people. Of silence that erased names. Of shadows born from grief and neglect. I named them as watchers, as echoes, as things bound to the cold and the forgotten. As I spoke, the house reacted. Walls steadied. Time slowed. The shadows recoiled, shuddering as if burned. They screamed. Not in pain. In recognition. I didn't stop. I told everything. Every journal entry, every warning, every story my grandmother had ever told me, and every one I tried to forget. The shadows thinned. They shrank, retreating to corners, flattening against walls, losing their stolen faces. One by one, they sank back into the house. Into the wood. Into the floors. Into the dark spaces between things. The front door slammed shut. The lights flickered on. Silence returned. Real silence. I collapsed. When I woke, morning light filled the room. Snow fell gently outside. The house was normal. Too normal. No shadows clung to the corners. No whispers lingered in the air. The clock ticked steadily. My grandmother's scarf lay folded on the chair. Empty. I was alone. And I knew. It wasn't over. Because stories don't end. They wait. And somewhere, deep in the walls of the house, something shifted. Listening. Spring arrived quietly. No dramatic thaw. No sudden warmth. Just a slow retreat of the cold, as if winter were backing away without turning its back. Snow softened into slush. Icicles wept themselves hollow. The sky lightened by degrees, day after day, until the gray loosened its grip. The house stayed standing. That felt important. For weeks after that night, I barely slept. When I did, I woke often, heart racing, convinced I'd heard movement in the walls or breathing just beyond the edge of the room. But nothing followed. No whispers. No footsteps. No shadows reaching where they didn't belong. Silence returned. Not the listening kind. The ordinary kind. I walked through the house slowly, room by room, as if relearning it. Sunlight fell where it never had before, filling corners that once drank darkness. Furniture sat where I left it. Doors stayed closed when I shut them. The house felt tired, like something that had endured a long vigil and finally been allowed to rest. I found my grandmother's journals stacked neatly on the dining table. I didn't remember doing that. I didn't remember much from the end, not clearly, just fragments. My voice echoing too loudly in the dark. Shadows shrinking away. Her face, relieved and unbearably sad. The journals were lighter now. When I opened them, the words remained, but the weight was gone. The ink looked faded, as if time had suddenly caught up with them. The last page of my grandmother's journal had changed. Where there had once been a warning, there was now a single line, written in her careful hand. "Thank you for remembering. I stayed in Raventown through the spring. People noticed me again. They asked polite questions, offered condolences for my grandmother, though their memories of her were vague, uncertain, like recalling a dream just after waking. Mrs. Calder's house stood empty across the road, its windows dark, its door sealed shut. No one mentioned her. When I asked, gently, if anyone remembered who had lived there before me, they frowned, uncomfortable. That house has always been empty, someone said. I stopped asking. Some truths resist being shared. The woods thawed last. Black pine shed its snow reluctantly, revealing bark scarred by age and something deeper. I never went back inside. I didn't need to. I could feel them from the edge. Not moving. Not watching. Waiting. That knowledge stayed with me when I finally left town. I didn't sell the house. I couldn't. Instead, I locked it carefully, left the lights off, and walked away as the road curved and hid it from view. I told myself it was over. I told myself that a lot. Time passed. Years, maybe. I moved somewhere warmer. Brighter. A place where winter was brief and forgettable. I found work. I spoke to people. I lived. Mostly. But winter nights still unsettled me. When the cold deepened and darkness arrived early, I felt it, that old pressure, faint but familiar. Not fear exactly. Recognition. That's when I started telling the stories. Not at first. At first I tried to keep them buried. I thought silence would finally be safe. I was wrong. The dreams came back. Subtle this time. Shadows standing just out of sight. Voices muffled by walls. The feeling of being gently nudged awake by something patient. So I spoke. I told friends strange stories by firelight. I shared unsettling memories on long drives at night. I wrote things down, careful and precise, the way my grandmother had taught me without realizing it. Every time I did, the pressure eased. Every time I stopped, it returned. I understood then. The shadows hadn't been destroyed. They had been contained. Stories were their boundaries, their cages, their mirrors. They existed only as long as someone remembered them, but they stayed harmless only as long as they were told correctly. Not sensationalized. Not exaggerated. Just true. Sometimes when I speak I feel it, that faint shift in the room, like something settling back into place. A shadow where it belongs. A silence that no longer listens. And sometimes I see things. A shadow that doesn't quite match its owner. A reflection that lingers a second too long. A dark shape at the edge of a winter road that looks almost human. I don't panic anymore. I tell the story again. Last winter, during the longest night of the year, my phone rang. No caller ID. I almost didn't answer. Almost. "Hello," I said. The line was quiet. I heard faint static, like wind moving through bare branches. Then a voice, old, thin, and trembling with effort. "You're still telling them," it said. I closed my eyes. "Yes," I replied. A pause. "Good," the voice whispered. "They're restless tonight." The call ended. I sat there for a long time, staring at my own shadow stretched across the wall by the lamp. It didn't move when I shifted. That was good. Very good. I turned the light off anyway, just in case. Somewhere, in a house at the edge of a town buried by snow, winter settles in again. The walls creak. The woods lean closer. Shadows gather where light can't quite reach. They are patient. They always have been. But as long as someone remembers, as long as the stories are told, they will stay exactly where they belong. And if, one winter night, you feel the dark grow heavier, if silence presses too close, if a shadow seems to recognize you, listen carefully. It may not be coming for you. It may only be waiting for you to remember.